So my name is Alexa. I'm with CCVO, which is the Calgary Chamber of Voluntary Organizations. We're a member-based charitable organization for those who aren't familiar. And we were established in 2004 to strengthen the nonprofit sector in Calgary in particular, and also Alberta. Much of the work that we do is province-wide, and address sector-related public policy issues. We're proud to support the nonprofit sector through research, advocacy, and convening. And I will say that while I'm the one here presenting, that much of the GR work is done by our CEO, who is, that's Karen Ball. She just happens to be on vacation. So otherwise she would probably be doing this presentation because a lot of the GR work, she does a lot of the heavy lifting on that one. And I want to acknowledge also Kirsten Boda, who's our research manager and does a lot of the background work. Marissa Barber, who's on our comms team, and Marok Yusuf Shahi, who's no longer at CCVO. She's moved on to another organization, but she also did much of the background work as well. And so in the description, what I did want to talk about this morning was to focus on a particular project that CCVO has been working on since the onset of the pandemic, and that is our Community Prosperity Now project, building a movement. And this is just a really quick slide. I wanted to show this just for those folks who aren't in Alberta and who may not be as familiar with the Alberta nonprofit sector. There's more than 26,000 nonprofits. Of course, that includes charities as well. And the sector is quite diverse. I think probably everybody on this call today would know that, and we're huge contributors to the economy, and a huge source of employment in Alberta as well, with about 286,000 employees. And on to the next. So the theme of the presentation I'm going to give today is this here: advocacy is a journey, not a destination. And most of this and what I'm about to say is possibly more of a reminder for folks on the call, but I think it's important to say these things out loud, because I think it's easy to forget that no matter where you are in your advocacy journey, engaging in advocacy is a long-term commitment that requires persistence and dedication while working towards your desired outcome. And so while nonprofit organizations set out advocating for policy change, they might think it's possible to achieve change in a short period of time. And that's not usually the case. It takes often years for policy change to be realized, and multiple people working over different time periods, pulling on different kinds of levers. And so it's important to recognize that policy advocacy is an ongoing process marked with milestones and setbacks on the path to reaching an ultimate goal. And so each step taken, even ones that might seem counter to your efforts, is actually a step towards your nonprofit's end goal. And given that the rewards of your work are not always immediate, it's important to be committed to your goal and ensure that everyone involved in advocacy efforts has the same expectations from the outset. So this takes planning, organizing, patience, and persistence. And change doesn't happen overnight until it does. And then it's sort of just all of a sudden things change. Policy advocacy is a critical and important activity for nonprofits seeking to achieve lasting and meaningful change. And nonprofits can bring about real change through policy advocacy, and it's an opportunity to advance your nonprofit's policy agenda with a strategic engagement strategy. But it's not time constrained, however, it's just an ongoing effort. And while it's strategic to capitalize on election periods, it's equally important to build relationships with key stakeholders and policymakers on a continual basis. Policy and regulations can be created and undone. They can be eliminated by a determined opposition party, refocused political attention, or a change of government. And the attention of legislators and policymakers can be short, sometimes just spanning between elections. And a change of government might bring to power politicians who know little or nothing about your issue. Even if it's the same government, there's often a change in politicians. So there's always ongoing effort to maintain those relationships, and public attention ebbs and flows. Your nonprofit's issue might be the focal point of public attention today, but tomorrow you might find the public has moved on to something else. So these are just some realities, and they're not to be discouraging. The ebbs and flows are just a natural part of democracy, and they reinforce why nonprofits must continue policy advocacy beyond election periods. And to reach your nonprofit's advocacy goals, remaining adaptive and open to trying different approaches is really important. So consider what you're comfortable compromising and what issues you will advocate for at all costs. Advocacy is often about dialogue and negotiation. It can be helpful to identify a fallback position that will allow you to still achieve an acceptable outcome, even if it's not perfect. Next slide, please. So this morning, what I want to do is just walk through highlights of our ongoing GR and advocacy journey. And this is a very important task that we have been making for Alberta's provincial government for nonprofits in Alberta. So we've been, you can see on the timeline here, we've been working at this since July 2020. So we identified a need very early that Alberta has a pandemic recovery that was focused on economic prosperity without recognizing the community prosperity that needs to go along with that. And we've been on a quest to secure a commitment from the provincial government for a fund to support the nonprofit sector's work in communities. We need a seat at the table as supported partners in the government's recovery plan. And a strong Alberta recovery is one with a plan to support the essential services we rely on every day, while making sure that no one is left behind. Our work touches on social and cultural issues and values that are otherwise underserved. And so also nonprofits have historically formed to fill a gap in services that aren't provided by government or private businesses. So it's important for us to be meaningfully involved. And so what I'm going to try and highlight, most of my presentation will go through this timeline, is just sort of give an example of the journey that our efforts to secure this commitment have taken, and to sort of highlight that there's really no one way, there's no one way to go at this. There's no right approach. And hopefully this story of our particular journey will spark something for you. And maybe you'll see opportunities for us to approach something differently. I'm always open to ideas, so very welcome for you to share those. So just this timeline will just give you a really quick sense of where we've been and where we're headed to. So we started in July 2020. Like I said, we've gone through a few iterations of some drafts of of some reports, some community engagement strategies. We've started a more of a public advocacy campaign, and now we're sort of starting our election advocacy planning, partially because we're not 100% sure that we won't get an early election call here in Alberta. It's not supposed to be for about another year, but there's sort of rampant speculation that it will be happening sooner than that. And our target, the ultimate goal that we want to reach, is a community prosperity fund in the following budget, which will likely be possibly for the governing party. It might be their platform if they put forward a budget, just given the election timing. So on to the next slide, please. So the journey begins, like I said, in July 2020. This was right at that point. We were just about 3 months into the pandemic. The nonprofit sector is starting to feel the impacts, and it feels like a long time ago now, to me anyway. But we knew even then that the fallout for the sector was really just beginning, and that this was probably going to be transformational for for a lot of people and certainly for the sector. And there certainly have been valuable lessons for the sector. So on the flip side of all of the fallout, just for example, the pandemic has really shone a light on inequities that exist, and the sector has a major role to play in shaping what our society is going to look like in the after times, because right now we're really living through a watershed moment where none of us are going to come out of this pandemic unchanged. And we certainly seem to be in a bit of a tumultuous negotiation at the moment, with some push-pull, with competing visions over what that's going to look like. But regardless, the nonprofit sector has a very crucial role to play in that. And on to the next slide. So in those early days, we did some research on what some of the main impacts to the nonprofit sector were. And this was just initially, so this was the first few months after the pandemic. We did a scan of surveys that had been conducted across the country. So this wasn't just Alberta. This was what nonprofits were seeing in Ontario and BC in particular. So what we found, demand for services at the same time as there was a drop in fundraising revenue, a drop in income, and 90% had gone to working remotely, which was just a really fast shift for folks. And on to the next. So then over the fall, we took what that initial research was on what the impacts were, and some sort of very initial recommendations that we had made coming out of what that fallout was for the nonprofit sector, one of which was a community prosperity strategy. And then we started really trying to dig a little deeper into what some of those recommendations were, and in particular the community prosperity strategy. So we did a series of blog posts and we published them on our website and sought feedback from people as we went. And then we took all of those recommendations, and based on the feedback we received, we rolled them up in a discussion paper that was intended to generate discussion on a community prosperity strategy for Alberta. And one of the main recommendations which again became the basis of much of our work over the last year and a half, was, and also formed the basis of our budget ask in 2021, was a request for $350 million social infrastructure fund. And so we chose that strategically to reflect the capital infrastructure priorities outlined in the Alberta's economic recovery plan from the provincial government. They later renamed that the Alberta's economic recovery plan to drop the economic, but it was focused almost entirely on capital infrastructure. And so we chose that social infrastructure name rather than what we are working with now, which is Community Prosperity Fund, simply as a strategic point in time choice, just to try and resonate with the language that the government was using of the day. So on to the next slide. So along came but the budget in February of 2021. Our ask was not included. And we did a general analysis of the budget, and we found that they really had three main priorities within that budget. It was economic recovery, increased efficiency in the delivery of government services, and nonprofits, I know, always get nervous as soon as we hear increased efficiency, because that translates often to cuts in our minds, and then immediate health, individual and business support. So that was some emergency supports. And on to the next. And so then we did a little bit of a cross-ministry comparison to really try to lift out what those priorities were for the government at that time. So remember, this is in 2021. So you can see that the ministries that got a big boost in funding were jobs, economy and innovation, and labor and immigration. Everything else was either a bit of a cut or most what we would call pretty much status quo. And those were organizations or ministries, pardon me, that work largely with the nonprofit sector and are responsible for some of the funding support. So children's services, community and social services, et cetera. So it was sort of a not great news budget for the sector all around. And there was really no concrete plan at all for the sector in that particular budget. Next slide, please. So over the spring of 2021, we then set about trying to move our ask forward. So we secured meetings across several ministries with elected officials and key bureaucrats in the ministries, as well as political staff. We pitched this ask to every one of these folks and asked for feedback, which fed into each of our subsequent meetings. And so I will say as well that we did work with a GR firm to gain access to be able to set up some of these meetings. Otherwise, I don't think we would have had that particular access. We had some mixed response. Some was very positive. Some were really initially indicated some interest in helping us move this forward, and then others not so much. But it didn't actually ever take off and go anywhere from those meetings. So that told us something as well. And then the next slide, please. So and simultaneously, while we were talking to government and trying to move that ask forward, we were also consulting with community leaders to talk about this recommendation for an investment into community prosperity, again, which we were calling a social infrastructure fund, the $350 million. And we found a ton of support among community leaders, certainly. And then I think probably most importantly, through those discussions, we certainly were made aware of some alienation that was being felt in the community, where people really did feel that it was missing from the province's economic recovery plans. And the next slide, please. So we chose to try and use this moment to have a new conversation with the province about recovery. We focused on an argument that no single economic recovery plan will be enough, and that communities must collaboratively negotiate the recovery process. We've had some natural disasters in Alberta that made that demonstration, and that future prosperity will be built through strategies that involve government, the nonprofit sector, and the private sector. So we were trying to access a policy window that was open right at that moment, one that was being used to create strategies and policies to build economic recovery. And truly, the nonprofit sector has been the backbone of Alberta in responding to the pandemic and in protecting the stability and health of our communities. And so we wanted to really rely upon, recognize that we had relied upon that and build and strengthen the Alberta that we all love. So next slide, please. So out of the discussion paper that we had written, the consultations that we had conducted with community leaders, as well as all the conversations we were having with the government, we published Community Prosperity Now, which is a blueprint for community recovery. And this was in June of 2021. So this was post-budget, post-consultation, where we were recognizing that community prosperity goes beyond economic prosperity. It centers community and recovery plans for a more resilient and equitable future, one where we reject a return to the status quo and emerge stronger and more robust. The Community Prosperity Now report included a lot, but sort of just broadly, in the interests of time, it included recommendations for the nonprofit sector, a call for the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and governments to work together, and a strong recommendation for an investment in community prosperity or a social infrastructure fund in Alberta. And so shortly after this publication, we did shift our language because from social infrastructure fund to a community recovery fund with still the same initial ask of $350 million. And then on to the next slide. So in particular, in the reframing of the nonprofit sector, we wanted to see us positioned in the source of strength that we truly are. And so what we were asking was for the nonprofit sector to really take the lead on community recovery. We should own that, and other sectors look to us for that leadership. That funders need to trust the nonprofit sector. The private sector needs to champion the nonprofit sector. So talk about the nonprofits in rooms that we don't have access to necessarily, and that the provincial government needs to value the nonprofit sector. And that's where the requests lived for our social infrastructure fund, community prosperity fund. And on to the next slide, please. So then over the summer and the fall of 2021, we examined the areas of priority for investment of a community recovery fund, and we identified the following areas. This was just based on our own research and through our knowledge of what the sector was looking for was around equity, diversity, and inclusion, mental health, youth engagement and retention, and digital transformation. And so we were looking for nonprofits that work in those areas to be supported, but also organizations that don't work in those areas to be able to move those initiatives forward. Those became apparently quite crucial throughout the pandemic. And so we did also have an economist at the U of C calculate the Jobs Multiplier, and this investment would create 4,500 jobs, mostly for women and racialized people who work in the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector is about 75% women. And so these areas became then sort of a bit of a key focus, so that we had some specific asks within that $350 million. It wasn't just a blanket fund. We were able to then talk about some areas that we had identified. And so then budget 2022 came along in February, and the request was not met. So CCVO conducted a deep dive analysis, and you can find all of that on our website if you're interested. And that's, again, kudos to our research manager for pulling all of that together. But here are just a few highlights, which is that the priorities of the budget in 22, the most recent budget that we've just had, we're enhancing government services now and for the future, growing Alberta's economy, and fiscal sustainability. And so the budget did actually show a projected surplus. It wasn't even just balanced, there was a surplus. And it just didn't recognize the importance of community recovery or identify the nonprofit sector as a leader in that effort. And there were no new major investments to support community recovery. And instead, investments made into recovery are centered on job creation and diversification. And when it comes to investments in the sector, the focus is really on debt elimination and maintaining the status quo. And this is a quote from the fiscal plan, which says, until the debt is eliminated, resources will continue to be used to pay interest costs rather than being directed to delivering the important government programs and services that Albertans rely on. And on to the next slide, please. And again, we did a deep dive on all of this, that you can find the main takeaway from here is that the average change across all ministries was an increase of 2%, and an average change across key ministries related to the nonprofit sector was just an increase of 1%. Children's services is excluded from this only because of the childcare deal, so it really threw things off. So that's how. But this gives you just a really quick high level of indication of investment in the sector, and so it's just sort of an indication again of priorities. And the next slide, please. Basically, despite increases made in some key ministries, funding adjustments are negated by other cuts, rearrangement of funding, leaving the sector to fend for itself with limited resources. And the budget signals a continuation of the attitude that the sector does not play a role in recovery, and that it can be expected to continue operating with stable or decreased budgets in the foreseeable future. Further, the budget does not connect very specific programmatic details to the light items, so it's actually really hard to figure out how funding will flow to the community. And the next slide, please. So, advancing our ask so far this is not a great news picture probably. We've had 2 budget requests that have not been included, and all signs indicate that the nonprofit sector is not a priority for the government. So where do we go from here? Our next slide, please. So we have a few plans I wouldn't say we don't have quite a seat at the table yet. We just want to maybe make our seat a little firmer. But to do that, we've got some more research planned. It's some updated research on the impacts of the pandemic on the nonprofit sector. So we want to be able to really pinpoint investment areas and to be able to really demonstrate just how much of an impact the pandemic has had on the sector, and ideally which organizations sort of within subsectors, so arts or environment, etc. We're also planning a day on the ledge. So we'll be inviting key community leaders to a day on the legislature. All will be prepared to talk about the importance of community prosperity and the specific recommendations we've made, and how those will benefit communities that those folks represent. So we, because of the research I mentioned in the first bullet, we think we will have an idea of which specifically which organizations are operating in which areas by riding. So we will know which MLAs and ministers will be at our day on the ledge, and we will be able to break down for those folks how many nonprofits in their ridings and generally what areas they're working in. We're also planning a community leaders summit, which is also known as a civil society leaders summit, to use the government's language. It'll span the course of 2 days. It'll prioritize facilitated discussion and network time, and it will create spaces that stimulate critical conversations and maximize the potential of leaders to work across sectors within civil society. So participation, we're looking at about 100 folks. It'll be nonprofit leaders, government officials, private sector social impact leaders, and individuals with distinguished experience as sector change makers. And then the last bit is on our platform asks and analysis. So we will be we're starting that work now, as I mentioned, in terms of our election advocacy period. And one of our major platform asks will continue to be a $350 million community prosperity fund. And so we'll be looking for that commitment from all parties as we move into an election phase. And that's on the next slide. We will be using that election cycle to our advantage. So we're probably entering a period where the government's going to be looking for good news announcements. And so we will be reinvigorating our ask and putting that forward as a potential to really be a good news announcement across communities in the province. And then also remembering that even if the current party forms a majority government again, that it is effectively a new government, because there will be new folks elected and new staff and new players and a new playing field effectively. So we will continue to take every opportunity and pull every lever to get to yes on a community prosperity fund for Alberta. So on the face of it, I think this story might seem like one of failure, but because our ask has not had a yes. But we've really learned a lot along the way, and we are now seen by government as influential. We know they pay attention to our analyses and to our reports. They ask us for our input, and we'll keep the seat that we have at the table and keep pushing to make that seat a little bigger. And now, if we do get to yes, we've put the work in to really think through the composition and the reasoning for a full ask. And if we don't, then we can retool after the election and go from there. And then the next slide, these are really fast. These are some resources. Next one, next slide, please. I just wanted to leave you with something concrete. So these are just a really quick glimpse at some resources you can find on our website. And so maybe some of these will pique your interest. They're in what we call our everyday policy advocacy guide. So there's a chapter on rules of engagement, talking about the difference between nonpartisanship and partisanship. And the next slide is there's a whole chapter on creating a policy agenda and some tips there. Next slide. There's one on government relations, so breaking down who does what, which level of government, and the next one. And then tips on how to do an engagement strategy, so a whole chapter on that and how to craft that as well. And the next slide, please. And then media relations. So that's a big one, and often we ignore that one sometimes in the nonprofit sector, but the stories are quite often the way to move these things forward. And the last slide, I think, just shows you where you can find all of those resources. And again, it's called the Everyday Policy Advocacy Guide. But if you go to the policy section of our website, you will find a ton of other resources and the budget analyses that I mentioned, as well as all of the reports that we've drafted, as well as our budget submissions. So I will leave it there. And I think I tried to leave a few minutes for questions, just in case anybody had anything they wanted to ask about.
Are you able to see the Q&A at all?
Let me see.
If you can't, I can read it out to you, or Neat can, because we've got a question there for you.
I don't see a question.
I have it up, and hopefully you can hear me. So has there been recommendations to the Alberta government to have its own nonprofit department or minister, similar to the BC parliamentary secretary, or mimicking the recommendations made at a federal level, I suppose, what Imagine Canada is doing?
Yes, so there hasn't been formally yet. We're currently talking that through over whether or not that will form one of our platform asks. So currently we're consulting on whether or not that's a good idea, because we have a few things in Alberta that exist already. There's something called the ANVSI, the Alberta Nonprofit Sector Voluntary Initiative, and it's sort of intended to fill that function. And so we would have to make some very clear recommendations about what happens to that if we had something that was more like what BC has with the Secretariat. Although I would like to talk to somebody in BC about their experience with that Secretariat. BC was successful in securing a nonprofit sector resiliency fund in their most recent budget. And I'm just curious if that Secretariat had a role to play in that.
Thank you. We still have a few more minutes, and I have a few questions, if that's okay. But one of the questions is, so it's obvious that there's been a ton of research that's behind all of what you've done. So for the smaller nonprofits, the smaller charities that are out there trying to get a seat at the table as well, how would you recommend, any tips or advice on how they can sort of advance their message with research, but knowing that they may not have a manager of policy or a director of research? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there are tons of there's tons of existing research, so it doesn't have to be primary research that you access to use to make your case. But even at that, I would say stories are quite powerful, and the impact that things are having, not so much on the organization, but on the people or the communities that you're serving. Those are very, very powerful. So even if you can collect a few examples, and research can be a loose word in that sense, that if there's a methodical way to collect some of the impacts that folks are seeing in those smaller nonprofits, that's a powerful way to send a message as well. And
Yeah.
often, even with, to go back to your original question about research, it's one or two stats is often enough for that case. So while we've done a lot of the background and supporting work, because we're doing this as an umbrella sort of, sector wide, that might not necessarily be required for a smaller nonprofit to make their case.
Yeah. Okay, great. And one last question about the, it's clear that, there was a bunch of research that was done and used in this, but also there must have been a strategy that guided this whole process, right? And so in terms of the strategy, not in terms of the strategy around messaging, but the strategy around who do you include in your advocacy efforts? So are you including board members? Are you including, I know that you're including community leaders, but how does that look to the Calgary Chamber of Voluntary Organizations?
Yep, absolutely. Our board members are included in that, and particularly their networks. So if there are folks that they have access to that we would like to talk to, absolutely. We also have some committees that we work with. So we have an advisory committee that gives us just really good advice on our public policy and government relations. And so we ran a lot of this by them in terms of that strategy. This wasn't done in a vacuum. We talked to a lot of people and really tried to understand the political landscape and what's happening in Alberta, which is really hard in Alberta to understand what's happening politically. But
well, you are, I think, preparing for an election, and good luck with that. And it's been my experience too that just because your ask didn't make it into the budget, and maybe twice in a row it didn't make it into the budget, but it doesn't mean you stop, right? You continue. And you keep pushing and you build brick by brick. And I think that's been consistent even from these morning sessions, right? That it's not going to happen overnight until it happens overnight, like you said, right? So thank you so much, Alexa. I always found the work of the CCVO so inspiring, I don't know what the word is, sophisticated, I find, because you're really focused on good quality messaging. You do it the right way. And I think a lot of people learned a lot today, including me. So thank you. And I invite you to continue on as an attendee for this.
thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you.